This is the first of two hearings the committee will hold this week to continue examining the current domestic terrorism threat in the United States and the actions the federal government should take to address this alarming rise of extremist violence, including white supremacist violence, anti-government violence, anti-Semitic and other faith-based violence, and violence targeting communities of color. Today, we will hear from experts representing faith-based, civil rights, academic and policy research organizations on how increasing violent attacks motivated by ethnicity, race, religion, and politics have impacted countless Americans. I'd like to thank each of our witnesses for joining us today and for their work in the public and private sectors to protect the American people. I look forward to hearing each of your perspectives on how to better define this threat and its roots, how it spreads, the impact it has on communities, and what more the federal government should do to address domestic terrorism while respecting American civil rights and their civil liberties. In the last few years, our nation has witnessed horrific acts of violence, such as the massacres at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and a shopping center in El Paso that targeted Black, Jewish, and Latino Americans, respectively. Even more recently, we have seen rising violent attacks on Asian Americans and a growing anti-government movement that planned and executed an attack on the seat of our democracy earlier this year. While these only represent a handful of attacks driven by white supremacy and violent extremism, each one takes an unimaginable toll on the victims and their families. Communities across the country live in fear that they could be attacked or murdered on the street, in their place of worship, or while going about their daily lives just because of who they are. I'm particularly concerned that these attacks, along with the growing climate of hateful rhetoric, intimidation, and targeted violence that we are seeing across the country, are a signal of something worse to come. If the federal government does not take swift action to address this festering threat, I fear we'll see more tragic attacks and lose more lives to domestic violent extremism. But effectively combating this growing threat requires the federal government to accurately assess it, track and publicly report these incidents, and use that data to ensure that we are devoting the appropriate resources and personnel to tackle the threat. Organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and the Center for Strategic and International Studies have tracked data related to domestic violent extremism and concluded that our nation is facing the highest levels of violence based on religion, race, ethnicity, and politics in decades. I'm disappointed that despite these clear warning signs, the federal government has failed to effectively track rising domestic terrorism threat. I've been raising concerns about this failure for years. I worked alongside Senator Johnson to write a provision signed into law as part of the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act to require DHS, FBI, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to better track and publicly report this critical data. Despite passing the law, the first report was nearly 9 months overdue and did not provide all of the requested data. We need to get serious about taking on these heinous threats and the violence that stems from them. In my view, we must change the way the federal government approaches domestic terrorism. That will require not only improving the way government tracks the threat, but also better understanding how these hateful ideologies spread across social media platforms and how that online transmission can lead to real-world violence. This is an issue that this committee will continue to examine throughout the year. And I look forward to taking what we learned from our witnesses today and using it to inform our efforts going forward. Whether we are conducting oversight or working on additional policy solutions, we must ensure that we're doing everything in our power to address the grave threat posed by domestic terrorism. With that, I'll turn it over to Ranking Member Portman for his opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your holding this hearing to examine the persistent and concerning threat posed by domestic terrorists and violent extremists. This is a threat to communities all across our country. Today we will hear from representatives of certain communities that have been affected by the violence they have experienced. While I'm very much looking forward to hearing their testimony, it's important we recognize all communities that have been impacted by domestic terrorism and violent extremism. Not all of those are represented here today. It's important to recognize the threat of all types of domestic terrorism. Interestingly, just in the last week here in the United States Senate, we have been learning more about one of those domestic terrorist threats listed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation that we won't hear about today. This is eco-terrorism. It turns out that one of the nominees from the Biden administration nominated to run the Bureau of Land Management had been involved in eco-terrorism, putting spikes into trees that then cause injury to loggers and others who were involved in timbering. So there are lots of kinds of terrorism. Domestic terrorists and violent extremists are not a new phenomenon, nor are the methods that are used to advance their causes. As chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which is a subcommittee of this full committee, I held a hearing in July of 2016 examining foreign terrorists' use of our Internet and social media platforms for radicalization and recruitment. That hearing was also aimed at understanding the threat and how the federal government was and should be addressing that threat. And we heard directly from witnesses at the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the State Department. This was a bipartisan investigation that was shocking. I'm disappointed that we will not hear testimony today from a single government official about how the federal government is addressing the domestic terrorism and violent extremism threat. Each of the witnesses at that July 2016 Permanent Subcommittee Investigations hearing highlighted the challenges we face in combating terrorism and violent extremism in the age of the Internet, including the reality that the digital environment often accelerates recruitment and radicalization efforts, and the speed with which individuals online can mobilize to violence, often referred to as the flash-to-bang effect. 5 years later, we are still seeing the same weapons being used within our own communities, and we are also increasingly seeing many domestic violent actors connecting with and learning from foreign groups and individuals. Domestic terrorists and violent extremists, inspired by a range of ideological beliefs, on the right and on the left, are increasingly using these digital platforms to spread hate and incite violence here at home. As Americans, we value our First Amendment rights, of course, including the right to express our beliefs. But nothing gives someone a right to carry out acts of violence. We must also acknowledge recent violence in the form of assaults on government, specifically law enforcement. Violent extremists from all segments of the ideological spectrum are increasingly targeting the military, law enforcement, and government personnel. I wrote a letter to the Department of Homeland Security, to the Secretary of Homeland Security, Mayorkas, in May, requesting information on what the department was doing to deter and combat these violent attacks, including on their personnel. Any attack on our nation's law enforcement or other government officials is an attack on the rule of law and on our American ideals. The safety and security of our communities has been a key priority for this committee and for me. After the Pittsburgh Tree of Life tragedy in October of 2018, I brought together leaders of faith-based groups and nonprofit entities across Ohio for a faith security conference in Columbus to discuss how to best respond to these threats. We had the Department of Homeland Security there. We had the FBI there. We talked about what could be done, and at that conference, we said that Congress can and should do more. And I redoubled our efforts here in Congress to provide communities with the resources needed to protect themselves from acts of violence. I've worked to establish and support the Department of Homeland Security's Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which allows nonprofits to apply for funds they can use to secure their facilities. Last year, our bipartisan Protecting Faith-Based and Nonprofit Organizations from Terrorism Act, with Chairman Peters, was signed into law, which authorized a record $75 million annually for 5 years for this grant program. Further, in wake of the recent violence against religious communities, I sponsored the bipartisan Pray Safe Act with Senators Hassan, who's with us today, Senator Johnson, Rounds, Peters, and Rosen, to establish a federal clearinghouse so that faith-based entities can access safety and security best practices available federal grant programs, and training opportunities. The threats and senseless attacks on all faith-based organizations and houses of worship must stop. But in the interim, I urge my colleagues to support this important bipartisan legislation to provide that critical information. I'm pleased to see my former Ohio colleague in the U.S. House of Representatives among our witnesses today, Eric Fingerhut, and I appreciate his personal commitment to, and the Jewish Federation of North America's support of, the Pray Safe Act and the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. Let me be clear. There is no place for hatred or bigotry of any kind toward our fellow citizens. In confronting these challenges, we must take a holistic approach to these threats. Today's witnesses will speak to this topic. We also need to hear and learn from government witnesses who are not here today about the magnitude of the threat and how the federal government is responding to it. Only after hearing these relevant perspectives can we develop a comprehensive strategy to combat these troubling trends. I appreciate the witnesses being here today. Again, I look forward to your insights and perspectives, but most importantly, your ideas on how we can better combat terrorism and violent extremism in our country so that we can learn what more Congress can and should do to counter those threats. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman. And as you're well aware, this is a complex and an important issue. And I agree with you that we need to hear from government witnesses. It's our intent to bring them in when we come back in September to have a hearing with them to pick up on what we're going to cover today as well as on Thursday. It's the practice of the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if you will stand and raise your hand, including those on video, I'd appreciate it. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
I do.
For the record, everybody answered affirmatively. You may be seated. Thank you. Our first witness today is Mr. Wade Henderson, who currently serves as the interim president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which advocates on behalf of more than 200 national civil and human rights member organizations. The Leadership Conference's members include the Anti-Defamation League, the ACLU, the NAACP, the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services, and the American Jewish Community, among others. Prior to his role with the Leadership Conference, Mr. Henderson was the Washington Bureau Director of the NAACP. Welcome, Mr. Henderson. You are now recognized for your 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and members of the committee. Thank you for holding this important hearing today on the federal response to domestic terrorism. Last week, the House Select Committee held its first hearing investigating the violent January 6th attack on this very institution, an attack fueled by white supremacy. We all saw a Confederate flag unfurled in the Senate chamber that day. We all saw people wearing anti-Semitic paraphernalia. And we all saw a noose constructed outside of the U.S. Capitol. It was unlike anything we have experienced since the Civil War. As we heard from Capitol and Metropolitan police officers who were on the front lines that day, the horrific consequences of the insurrection are still with us now. And for our diverse coalition, made up of more than 220 national organizations committed to the protection of civil and human rights, this violence is anything but new. For more than 400 years, Black, Brown, and Native people and other marginalized groups have borne the brunt of structural inequality, racism, and discrimination. Policies like American chattel slavery, the forced removal of Native people from their homelands, Black codes, Jim Crow segregation, redlining, lynchings, and racial discrimination have all contributed to intergenerational harm that persists today. Indeed, today marks the 2-year anniversary of the tragic attack in El Paso, Texas, when a white supremacist gunman murdered 23 people. We know that for too long, the threat of this violence has been weaponized, not only by white supremacists, but also by laws and programs that target us rather than protect us. To address white supremacist violence and terrorism, I'd like to offer 4 recommendations today. First, Congress must pass the For the People Act to push back against the great white supremacist lie that encouraged the January 6th insurrection and has given rise to unprecedented attacks against voting rights. This Friday marks the anniversary of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The Senate must pass S1 and honor the many who gave their lives to protect our democracy. Second, Congress should demand that federal agencies show how they are fighting white supremacist violence through existing tools and reject any new domestic terrorism charge or sentencing enhancements. There are already more than 50 terrorism-related statutes on the books and over a dozen other criminal laws, some of which are being used to prosecute the January 6th insurrectionists. Our nation's long history of abusing national security mechanisms, including the use of COINTELPRO against Dr. King, the post-9/11 targeting of Arabs and Muslims, and the FBI's prioritization of, quote, Black identity extremists, unquote, serve as cautionary tales of how expanded national security authority leads to unjust targeting of already over-policed communities. Third, Congress must identify ways to address and dismantle white supremacy in law enforcement. While many police officers work to fulfill their duties honorably, transformational change is still needed to address the culture of policing that helps promote white supremacy groups, as well as discriminatory policing practices and policies that make us all less safe. Congress must demand a full accounting of how law enforcement is addressing white supremacy in their ranks, and the White Supremacy in Law Enforcement Information Act is a good first step. Congress and federal agencies must also identify ways to ensure that officers who incite racist violence are no longer welcome. It's why the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is so important. Finally, Congress must pass H.R. 40 to study reparations for African Americans and create a U.S. Commission on Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Excuse me. May and June 2021 marked the centennial anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, when a white supremacist mob murdered Black Americans and burned the businesses and homes to destroy the successes of the Black Tulsa community. Yet many Americans still know nothing about this tragedy or others that have flowed from slavery until today. Black people have been targeted with brutal violence, and they continue to be deprived of the benefits of economic growth. Congress must pass H.R. 40 and come to terms with the contradiction of who we say we are as a democracy and who we actually are. Reparations are owed, transformation is required. Now is the time to create a shared vision for our nation, one where all people feel safe, valued, and heard. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Our second witness, former Congressman Eric Fingerhut, is the president and CEO of the Jewish Federations of North America, which comprises more than 146 independent federations across the United States and a network of 300 smaller Jewish communities around the globe. Together, these organizations work to protect and enhance the well-being of the Jewish community worldwide. Prior to his role, Congressman Fingerhut served as CEO of Hillel International, the largest Jewish campus organization in the world. He served as an Ohio State Senator and represented Ohio's 19th Congressional District here in Washington. Welcome, Mr. Fingerhut. You are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Peters. Thank you to my home state Senator, Ranking Member Senator Portman, and to all the members of this distinguished committee. This is indeed an important hearing which covers a truly pernicious threat to racial, ethnic, and religious communities, and that requires a compelling and timely congressional response. I speak, of course, of the rise of domestic and violent extremism. Senator Peters, Mr. Chairman, You outlined correctly the role of the Jewish Federations. I know that the distinguished members of this committee are familiar with the work of the Jewish Federation system and with our volunteer and professional leadership in your respective states. And we thank you for all the many ways that you have each supported our mission across the full spectrum of Jewish communal life. Now, security has always been a core concern of Jewish federations. We know that the ability and the confidence of our community to participate fully in Jewish religious and cultural life depends on feeling safe. Safe to attend synagogue, safe to drop our children off at the Jewish Community Center for preschool or day camp, safe to walk down the street wearing visibly Jewish head coverings and clothing, safe to gather in groups to celebrate, to mourn, to support our brothers and sisters in the state of Israel, and to be active in the life of our communities, our campuses, and our civic associations. Now, our current era of security investments began immediately post 9/11, recognizing that the violent extremism that reached American shores that infamous day would certainly have consequences for our Jewish communities. Many Jewish federations began organizing local community security initiatives, led by experienced and trained local community security directors, to work with each of the synagogues and Jewish institutions in their communities. Today, roughly 45 Jewish federations have such initiatives and are currently raising and allocating approximately $30 million in private funds to this effort, above and beyond what each school, each synagogue, Jewish community center, and social service agency must spend on its own security. And we are in the middle of an extensive national effort called Live Secure, to ensure that every Jewish federation has such a system in place for its community. Now, at the national level, the Jewish Federations of North America helped create the Secure Community Network to offer the support our communities needed to establish and maintain these initiatives, as well as to provide communications links to and liaison with national law enforcement. We've been proud to work with the Department of Homeland Security since its creation to advance this work. Now, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the Jewish community, the rising threat not only includes, of course, the horrific killing of 11 Jewish congregants who were praying at the Tree of Life Synagogue building in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in October 2018, but also includes the mass shootings at a synagogue in Poway, California in December 2018, and at a kosher market in Jersey City, New Jersey in December 2019, the deadly machete attack at a Hanukkah celebration in Muncie, New York, also in December 2019, the numerous physical attacks on the streets of Brooklyn and other communities that appear related to the clothing and appearance of Jewish victims, and now the most recent multiple stabbing of a rabbi in Boston this summer in front of the synagogue where he works. And of course, these are further exacerbated by the appearance of too many instances of anti-Semitic arson, vandalism, and disrupted plots and online hate that contain implicit threats of violence to come. To say that the Jewish community regards physical safety as today's highest priority and as a matter of great urgency is not an overstatement. Now, in 2004, Congress established the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. This is a coordinated, centralized program that promotes meaningful engagement of at-risk nonprofits with federal, state, or local homeland security officials, and provides critical resources to carry out preparedness planning and training, as well as the acquisition of target hardening investments. The program is groundbreaking, but it's tiny by federal standards. In its 17 years, it has assisted between 140 and 1,500 nonprofits annually at an average yearly appropriation of $35 million. This year, Congress appropriated $180 million for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which supported more than 1,500 awards, but this is still a tiny percentage of the approximately 350,000 to 400,000 individual congregations within the United States and 1.3 million charitable nonprofits serving communities throughout the country. We respectfully request that the Congress ensure that the resources are there to fulfill all the legitimate and documented applications that are made. Nevertheless, the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, while important, cannot in and of itself adequately mitigate the risk to the charitable sector of this great threat. We therefore respectfully request that Congress designate the charitable sector as a critical part of the nation's infrastructure, supported by a comprehensive plan and the necessary resources to manage its risks, resilience, and security outcomes, as this has afforded 16 other currently designated vital sectors. Substantially increase the funding to the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, as I have suggested, and to further ensure the integrity of the program, to include the quality of its and to improve the quality of its oversight and technical assistance to its stakeholders, we ask that Congress provide additional and specified resources to the NSGP program office located within FEMA, and that Congress allow the state administrative agencies to withhold up to 5% of the NSGP awards to cover their management and administrative costs. We request that Congress increase access to DHS's cybersecurity and infrastructure security agencies, protective security advisors, and cybersecurity advisors. And as Chairman Peters mentioned, enact the Pray Safe Act and Ranking Member Portman to improve stakeholder outreach and engagement by establishing a federal clearinghouse through which faith-based organizations, houses of worship, and other nonprofits can access centralized information on safety and security best practices. Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, members of the committee, thank you for holding today's hearing to explore what compelling steps the committee and Congress should take to ensure the safety and security of nonprofit organizations, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Engerhut. Our third witness is Mr. John Yang, as president of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Mr. Yang works to address systemic policies, programs, and legislative attempts to discriminate against and marginalize Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and other minority communities. Prior to his current role, Mr. Yang co-founded the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing the legal needs of Asian Pacific Americans in the D.C. metropolitan area. Mr. Yang, welcome to the committee. You may now proceed with your 5-minute opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peters, and thank you to Ranking Member Portman and all the other members of this committee for holding this important hearing. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before all of you today. I also appreciate hearing from my good friend and colleague, Wade Henderson. His words, as always, are insightful, powerful, and I agree wholeheartedly with his assessment and recommendations. Merriam-Webster defines terrorism as the systemic use of terror, especially as a means of coercion. Terror, in turn, is defined as a state of intense or overwhelming fear, and violence or the threat of violence used as a weapon of intimidation or coercion. Under these definitions, the Asian American community has been living under a state of terrorism for the past 18 months, and certainly in the first 6 months of 2021. A Pew report shows that over 60% or approximately 60% of Asian adults have heard people express racist or racially insensitive views about people who are Asian than it was before COVID-19. A similar Ipsos survey in 2020 showed that over 60% of Asian Americans witnessed someone blaming Asian Americans for COVID-19. In the course of talking to the Asian American community, whether at community events, through employee resource groups at companies or government agencies, or just in casual conversations, some difficult themes have emerged. In these discussions, individuals have described how they have feared for their elders' safety, as well as that of their children and themselves. They have described telling elders not to go out alone, have described their own fear in doing the same, and how they have isolated themselves because of these issues. They have told stories of being spat upon, coughed upon, pushed, ridiculed in front of their children, and otherwise treated as the other, unworthy of respect as a human being. This is the lived reality of the Asian American community right now. If domestic terrorism is understood to be creating fear within a community, such that the community may be coerced, intimidated, or silenced, what has happened to the Asian American community must be properly viewed as terrorism. Indeed, the statistics confirm the basis for these fears. Through reporting done by Stop AAPI Hate, combined with data from Asian Americans Advancing Justice and other organizations, over 7,500 acts of anti-Asian hate have been reported since February of 2020. And we all know about the very real physical violence against our community, whether it is the murder of an 84-year-old Thai American in California, the murder of 6 Asian American women in Atlanta, or the murder of 4 Sikh Americans in Indianapolis, not to mention the countless other acts of physical violence taking place throughout the country. This violence against the Asian American community is rooted in 2 very dangerous stereotypes about the Asian American community, that of the perpetual foreigner and that of the model minority. Asian Americans are seen as the perpetual foreigner, such that we are seen as foreigners, not of this country, as of the other, regardless of how long we have been in this country or whether we were born in America. On the flip side of that stereotype is that of the model minority, where Asian Americans are held up as the quote-unquote good people of color when it is convenient and used to plant seeds of division within allied communities of color. That model minority myth hides the complexities of our community and the economic disparities that exist among Asian Americans. Although the current round of anti-Asian hate can be said to have its origins in COVID-19, COVID-19 is not the only cause of anti-Asian violence. We have very legitimate geopolitical differences with the Chinese government, and that is likely to remain for the foreseeable future. If we are not careful, however, those differences will have consequences for our Asian American community, and we can expect a backlash against our community. We saw that happen with the incarceration of over 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent during World War II. We saw that happen in the backlash against the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian American community after 9/11. And we saw that happen with the murder of Vincent Chin 39 years ago during the heightened automobile trade war tensions that we had with Japan. Indeed, just as lynching and cross-burning are used as forms of terror against the African American community, we have seen the same in the Asian American community. While Asian Americans were doing some of the hardest work building the transcontinental railroad in the late 1800s, we saw Asian Americans being lynched and burned out of their homes in the western part of this country. We must be able to address these issues with a proper nuance and come together to call out xenophobia, racism, and hate whenever it occurs against our communities. And we must call out misinformation, disinformation, before it distorts reality. The dehumanization of Asian Americans by suggesting that we eat bats, have unsanitary habits, or deserve to be ridiculed must be rejected. Likewise, misinformation about who is attacking Asian Americans must be corrected. Notwithstanding attempts by some to create divisions within the community between African Americans and Asian Americans, let me be clear about one thing. Studies done by NIH and University of Michigan have shown that, notwithstanding these social media efforts, over 75% of the attackers against Asian Americans are Caucasians. A very small percentage are African Americans. The person who killed 6 Asian American women in Atlanta was Caucasian, a Caucasian male, as was the person that killed 4 Sikh Americans in Indianapolis. African Americans are not the predominant group attacking Asian Americans, and such narratives are simply false. Facts, education, and data are the keys to addressing extremism. We cannot normalize racism and xenophobic behavior of those who seek to silence communities of color. Normalizing racism and xenophobia has created the conditions where people feel comfortable terrorizing other communities, inserting their privileges to intimidate and marginalize those communities. These are the issues we must confront if we are to prevent citizens in our country from terrorizing other residents of our country. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Yang, for your comments. Our next witness is Mr. Paul Goldenberg, Vice Chair of the Department of Homeland Security's Faith-Based Council and Senior Advisor to the Department's newly established Countering Violent Extremism Initiative. Prior to his current roles, Mr. Goldenberg played a key role in efforts to counter violent extremism in the United States and Europe, including as Chief of the Office of Bias Crimes and Community Relations in New Jersey. He is considered an international thought leader in information sharing, conflict resolution, public safety, and counterterrorism policy. Mr. Goldenberg, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Senator. I just want to we are no longer officially associated with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. As the ASAC has formally resolved, so I just want to be on record that I'm not representing the department. Thank you. Very good. The microphone on? Okay. Is it on now? Is the mic on now? Yes?
Doesn't appear to be.
It's on now? Okay, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Goldenberg, and I am here today as a senior fellow with the Rutgers University Miller Center for Community Resilience and Protection. And as I just stated, I most recently served as a senior advisor to the United States Department of Homeland Security,
where there I was a member of the Secretary's Advisory Council. And while in that capacity, I did in fact head several initiatives focused on domestic and international terrorism, such as the Countering Violent Extremism Subcommittee, the Foreign Fighter Task Force, and yes, more recently had the honor and privilege of serving alongside United States Marine Corps General John Allen, retired, where we together co-chaired the subcommittee for the prevention of targeted violence against faith-based communities. Before that, I did command the nation's first ever state office dedicated to the investigation and prosecution of biased crimes and domestic terrorism, situated in New Jersey. I'm very proud and honored to be here today speaking with your committee on these topics, and I sincerely applaud you, chairmen, members, of your steadfast commitment and unwavering support to address these serious matters impacting our nation's national security. Look, in framing my testimony, I think it's important to look first beyond America's borders. Across Europe, many houses of worship are surrounded by elite military units standing guard with automatic weaponry, reinforced by heavy armored personnel carriers. Guard towers augment the once stately and welcoming entryways. Flower beds have been swapped for barbed wire, all at a cost of hundreds of millions of euros, and producing a dreadful, unbelievable impact on the psyche of Europe's people. You see, Europe has become America's canary in a mine. In my work with Rutgers, along with former New Jersey Attorney General John Farmer, we traveled across Europe where we met with victims, painstakingly following the stories of those who suffered horrific attacks on their communities and houses of worship. Right here in the United States, as part of our work with the HSAC subcommittee, we had the sobering and humbling experience of meeting members of communities who had directly experienced the terror and violence, many of which were themselves victims of targeted attacks. Without exception, as these communities worked through their grief, they were so eager and committed to helping the members of our subcommittee with our work. You see, the adverse impact that violent extremists and domestic terrorists, including those inspired by white supremacist ideologies, are having on vulnerable communities are difficult to overstate. From Oak Creek, Wisconsin, to Whitefish, Montana, from Southern California to Sutherland, Texas, from Minneapolis to Pittsburgh, targeted violent attacks against vulnerable communities and the institutions they represent have struck at the very core of American freedoms. Standing out not just for the escalating death toll, but for the cruelty of wounding and killing people at their most vulnerable, while assembled in their houses of worship for prayer. What was once unthinkable has become almost anticipated. The increasing influence of white supremacist, separatist, radical right, left extremist ideologies and inspiring acts of domestic terror and targeted violence is moreover not a matter of political opinion, but a demonstrable fact. Most attacks are committed primarily by lone attackers, as opposed to organized cells or through a system of cells. There are, however, a lot of similarities to the attacks once perpetrated by ISIS, jihadists, white and black separatist groups, and other extremists. They're acting very much alike. These bad actors are radicalized and freely communicate as a part of a wide-ranging movement. The social media platforms and individuals that frequent and govern these sites have implemented a comprehensive transnational outlook, very much like ISIS inspired and connected with their potential radicals across the globe. While supremacist and similar violent extremist groups now share manifestos, conspiracy theorists, hate literature, and are connecting daily with like-minded persons online, beyond the conventional social media platforms, white supremacists and other violent extremists are using lesser-known platforms as well as encrypted channels. Their tactics is to exploit the openness of the instrumentalities of freedom, in this case, social media and the internet, to destroy freedom itself, in this case, the foundational freedom of religious conscience. They know that this is our Achilles heel. In fact, very much so, our Achilles heel. The primary inspiration behind many of these targeted attacks is to force us to not merely question our fundamental safety and security as a nation, as well as our ability to protect ourselves, our neighborhoods, and our families, but to challenge our behaviors. You see, success in the eyes of these domestic violent extremists and international terrorists comes when we depart from our daily routines, our way of living, and even spiritual and political beliefs. Violent extremists understand the power of fear, and they're getting pretty good at it. As anti-Asian, racist, anti-Semitic attacks proliferate, we need to consider the fact that no racial or religious group is being singled out just exclusively, although some are disproportionately targeted. As hatred and bigotry exists today on both the radical left and the extreme right sides of the ideological spectrum, it can be observed among the affluent, the poor, the more or less highly educated, the fervently religious, and the devoutly secular. And it's sometimes expressed crudely, other times in the language of sophisticated and supposed academically correct. Turning the problem to solutions. In closing, how do we work with American law enforcement to provide them with the needed tools to address this challenge? Notwithstanding the existing framework, gaps do exist in law enforcement as they have been hampered in addressing the rise of white supremacist and other domestic-related attacks by the inability to classify such attacks as acts of domestic terror. The absence of that category has led law enforcement to treat attacks committed by violent extremists at times as isolated, unconnected incidents. It has also rendered of extremely limited value the uniform crime reporting and other reporting mechanisms which may record similar events differently. In the absence of the ability to label white supremacists and other like-minded extremist groups as acts of domestic terrorism, I had been informed by state and local law enforcement that they have been unable to avail themselves of resources dedicated to countering these types of terrorism incidents, such as additional personnel, training, and essential technologies that are supported by federal grant programs. I've come to learn that the goal of violent extremists is often not just to cause loss of life, more perilously, it's to wear us down, and that it's begun to do, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, causing our endurance, our determination, and moral to decay and ultimately disappear. As attacks perpetrated from these extremists and other similar separatist groups grow in number, we should be concerned that an adverse public reaction may generate something that these bad actors could never have achieved on their own. In closing, it's about educating lay leaders, community leaders, staff, administrators, teachers, and by more effectively working with our nation's law enforcement community. We have the fundamentals to empower ourselves, developing a sense of ownership amongst our entire community, working with state, local authorities, moving the American public beyond awareness to engage citizenry should be a primary goal for 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Goldenberg. Our next witness is Dr. Seth Jones, who serves as Senior Vice President, Harold Brown Chair, and Director of the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. With decades of experience in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, Dr. Jones leads a bipartisan team dedicated to providing independent strategic insights and policy solutions that shape national policy. Dr. Jones also teaches at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the Center for Homeland Defense and Security at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. Welcome, Dr. Jones. You may proceed with your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and distinguished members of the committee. This is an important subject, and I'm glad we're here to discuss this. As this testimony will highlight, objective analysis, sound data are more important than ever to gauge the nature and the threat of domestic terrorism, as well as effective responses, including responses that Congress can take the lead on. I'm going to divide my brief comments into 5 sections. First, let me just highlight the terminology I'm going to use, and I think it's important. I'm going to focus here on terrorism, which includes the deliberate use or the threat of violence by non-state actors in order to achieve a range of goals, generally political goals, and to create a broad psychological impact. In my judgment, violence and the threat of violence are particularly important components of what I call terrorism and are an important aspect as we get into discussions about free speech. Free speech is certainly protected in the United States. Violence, including the threat of violence, start to cross lines. I'm also going to leverage, as part of this, a data set that we have created at the Center for Strategic and International Studies that goes back to the mid-1990s and that incorporates approximately 1,000 cases, which I take to be roughly the universe of plots and attacks in the United States and a range of categories within those. Second, let me just touch base on some of the trends in incidents and fatalities, because I think, again, data here is important. What our data indicates is that in 2020, the last full year, the number of domestic terrorist attacks and plots increased to its highest level since at least 1994, which is the first year of our data. Though it is important to note that fatalities were actually relatively low. Happy to get into why that is, but we're seeing a rise in attacks and plots. One of the reasons, it's my judgment, why we're seeing lower fatalities, at least for the moment, is that we're seeing indications from a number of organizations that are prioritizing sending a message rather than killing large numbers of people, the way we had seen with some of the Salafi jihadists inspired by the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. But that certainly could change, and I think the mid-1990s, including the Timothy McVeigh attack in Oklahoma City, highlights some of the long-term challenges. Let me also talk about targets. As we've heard from others on this that have testified so far, our list of targets includes a range of individuals in the U.S. based on ethnicity, race, religious beliefs, and other factors. We've seen individuals based on the fact that they're Jewish and the targeting of synagogues, Asian Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans, and others, including based on their political persuasion, so highlighting the polarization of politics, that they've all been targeted. I would also highlight that our data shows that the highest numbers of individuals in 2020 targeted were those in the military, police, and within the government, a notable increase. And I would also highlight that we're seeing individuals target the military, police, and the government from all sides of the ideological spectrum, from anti-fascists and anarchists to those that are white supremacists and anti-government. So again, focus from all sides of the political spectrum. Touching briefly on the fourth area, tactics and weapons, we see a number of explosives and incendiaries used. You've seen vehicles, but in terms of lethal and fatal attacks, the highest numbers, generally by far, both between that 1994 and 2020 period, 66% of those fatalities from domestic terrorism were caused by firearms. 73% of fatalities from domestic terrorism between 2015 and 2020 were also caused by firearms. Let me just finish. This is the fifth area. My written testimony includes a number of issues worth considering from a congressional standpoint, and we've also heard a number of comments from those that have testified so far. But let me highlight one issue with which the chairman mentioned in his opening remarks, and that is, I think the federal government has to be much more transparent about the state of domestic terrorism. That includes data that the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and to some degree also the National Counterterrorism, we have to be more transparent as a federal government, including at the state and local level, in key trends. Numbers of attacks and plots, fatalities, targets, tactics used. I find the level of transparency troubling within the government, different in many ways from what we see from our partners overseas. British intelligence, including MI5, have generally been quite transparent about trends. The Germans have been quite transparent, including the Ministry of Interior. And when I was in the U.S. government, in the Department of Defense, we were very transparent when I was there about the significant acts, which included terrorism in Afghanistan and Iraq. We are not there at this point, and I think this is an important component that you have already pushed and need to continue. So with that, I will hold my remarks, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jones, for your testimony. Mr. Henderson, you represent over 200 civil rights organizations, including ACLU, the NAACP, Access, ADL. So that means you and your members are basically at the forefront of the horrible and deadly reality that the threat of domestic terrorism presents from white supremacist, anti-government groups, conspiracy theorists, and the list of violent extremists that are operating in our country. My question to you, sir, is, in your view, how has this threat evolved for your members over the last few years?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. This issue of domestic terrorism, hate crime violence, call it what you will, has been a significant problem throughout the history of the African American experience and many other communities, as I mentioned in my formal testimony, that have been marginalized in American society throughout the time of their presence in this country. Again, I noted, of course, the experience of African Americans with chattel slavery, with Jim Crow segregation, with the deprivation of access to the right to vote, and continued violence directed toward our communities by way of lynching and pogroms that have actually occurred in communities like Tulsa, Oklahoma, and like the community in Florida that has been affected by all of this violence. The same is true of other groups. My colleague John Yang talked about the deprivation of liberty suffered by Japanese American citizens during World War II, or the experience of Native Americans who were forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands. All of these communities have experienced periods of violence directed at their members for a variety of reasons, but all of it stems from a source of white supremacist attitude toward these communities and the denial of their right to equal citizenship and equal protection of the law. Of course, the problem has been exacerbated in recent time by the availability of social media. And social media has contributed to the radicalization of individuals, to the isolation of others in ways that have fostered their involvement in this kind of white supremacist hate crime violence. It is an ongoing, continuing problem, one of significant magnitude, and needs to be addressed. Domestic terrorism is the #1 priority of the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. And so labeling does matter. However, it affects, of course, the allocation of resources by the federal government to address these issues. My main contention is that the federal government needs to do what it knows it is required to do by law with respect to all persons in the United States. It has the resources to address these issues. It does not have, at this point, the political will, and that is what I hope these hearings will help provide.
Thank you. Mr. Fingerhut, the Jewish community has seen some of the worst acts of violence and anti-Semitism in the history of this country in recent years, and you mentioned some of those in your opening testimony. My question to you is, how can federal agencies, especially the DHS, collaborate with state and local partners to assist these communities? What are the things that we must be doing now?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, I greatly appreciate the question. Of course, as I emphasized in my testimony, the support of the federal government for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program is essential. And critically, sir, it is, and members of the committee, it is not only an increase in funding, but it is as well the support for the agencies that administer those programs at the federal and at the state levels, and the commitment for the technical support for all of the faith-based and nonprofit institutions that are eligible to apply for them. These are by necessity somewhat technical in nature, and we do our very best through our Jewish Federation system and with our other religious and ethnic communal partners to educate all of the faith-based and nonprofit institutions about the method and the technical details of the applications. It nevertheless remains an important responsibility of DHS and of the FBI to assist these communities. As I mentioned in my testimony, the Secure Community Network, which is an organization that we started together with a conference of presidents of major Jewish organizations in the 2004 post 9/11 era, is in direct and regular contact with the Department of Homeland Security and is prepared to assist them in that effort. Secondly, as I also indicated in my testimony, Mr. Chairman, it is important that the faith-based and nonprofit community be designated as a critical infrastructure, as have 16 other sectors of our community of the nation's economy and communal infrastructure, so as to require the Department of Homeland Security and the other federal law enforcement agencies to create a comprehensive approach to working with the faith-based and nonprofit communities. As you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee well know, in our society, the way American society is structured, the partnership between government and the nonprofit and faith-based sectors in the delivery of core and essential human services, as well as education and communal activities of all kinds, is an essential partnership. And recognizing that critical infrastructure, as we just evidenced during the pandemic, the partnership between the federal government and the nonprofit and the faith-based communities were essential to carrying our communities through the COVID pandemic. And it will be so as well as we tackle the domestic extremism issues. In addition, finally, I'd repeat the comment I made about increasing access to DHS's cybersecurity and infrastructure security agencies, protective security advisors, and cybersecurity advisors to assist the nonprofits that navigating the grant opportunities. Again, the Secure Community Network would be our representative and also works with other of the faith-based and religious communities in that effort.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the detailed answer. Ranking Member Portman, you're now recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses for the information you provided, which was very helpful. Mr. Yang, I liked what you said, which is we need more facts, information, and data. And I think that's absolutely true. And we've heard today some data from some of our witnesses that is very concerning. Mr. Jones, can you discuss some of the data that you have compiled? And one thing I thought was interesting, you said that there are more attacks on military and police, I think you said law enforcement, than any other group. Can you tell us whether that's historically true, or is that just true in 2020? I thought you had some interesting data about other attacks, saying that threats and attacks are the worst they have been since 1994. But with regard to the information you provided us today, which is new to me, that the highest number of attacks have been on law enforcement, is that historically accurate, or is that just a recent development?
Excellent question. In response to your question about the targeting of government, military, and police, it is primarily a recent phenomenon. Government, military, and police have been targeted historically in the U.S. at various points. We certainly saw that in the mid-1990s in Timothy McVeigh's targeting of the Murray Building in Oklahoma City. But in terms of the number of attacks, we've seen amongst the highest levels in terms of attack target in 2020. So that is a recent phenomenon. And again, as I mentioned, we're seeing the perpetrators from all sides of the political spectrum, anarchists, anti-fascists, and others as well.
Yeah. Thank you. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate the concise answer, because we don't have much time here and there's lots of information I want to get out. Mr. Goldenberg, you talked a lot about your work and the factors contributing to the persistent threat of domestic terrorism and violent extremism. Can you talk a little about what you see as some of the common threads of domestic radicalization? And you've obviously got experience both at the state level and at the federal level through the Department of Homeland Security. Just give us a little sense of what are the common threads you've seen.
The tactics being used by extremists and radicals, from white supremacists to those that claim that they're going to attack in the name of jihad, to those even potentially engaged or involved, as you stated, sir, eco-terrorism. The tactics are very similar. About 4 or 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to co-chair the Foreign Fighter Task Force. We spent a lot of time studying the methodologies that ISIS was using to bring young men and women from different parts of the world who absolutely had very little in common, had very little knowledge, many of which weren't even that hooked into any particular religion, making their ways across oceans to join a fight and a war in the deserts of some unknown place. And we got very caught up in the cause, and we didn't study enough as to the effect. Why are these young, disaffected, disenchanted folks, these young people, joining these fights, joining these movements? Why are they being radicalized so quickly? And social media, it was all done. 95% of it, I may not be exact, of the radicalization was done through very effective, very savvy social media marketing campaigns.
Yeah, I think that we talked about the investigation we did here at the Permanent Subcommittee, which was a bipartisan look at why, and so much of it came down to the digital side, both in terms of organization and creating this motivation with white supremacists. I think the same is true from everything we know. And then on the actual attacks themselves, the ability to organize quickly, and the flash and bang effect we talked about earlier. So that, I mean, getting into the digital issues is really important. These platforms have created a bigger problem, clearly. Is that your understanding?
It is, but I have to state something for the record. I was very engaged and involved in Whitefish, Montana, which many people may not be aware of. It's a very pristine, beautiful place on the side of a mountain where 120 members of a Jewish community, many of them, I can't speak for all of them, literally 4 years ago were debating whether to leave their community. They were terrified. They were petrified because they were being attacked and trolled and threatened online from some very dangerous people. Some of these websites that were calling for attacks on this small Jewish community. In fact, the common denominator of these websites is the fact that members of those sites were involved in over 100 to 120 murders around the world, including Breivik, including several other major incidents here. Why am I bringing up Whitefish? Because as horrific, as horrible as these threats were perceived, people were terrified. It was, in my mind, a domestic terrorism incident, and it was very difficult to get any agency to even investigate it. And I'm not criticizing the agencies. I'm not criticizing the federal agencies or the local law enforcement agencies. They couldn't investigate it because they didn't have the probable cause to go ahead and open up an investigation, even though we had members of a community ready to leave their houses in terror, and we couldn't even get a criminal investigation initiated because we didn't have the laws or the mandates to work on it.
Well, those are important points, and I think that leads to some of the frustration out there is that you have these threats that are real, and yet there doesn't seem to be an easy way for law enforcement at local or state or federal level sometimes to respond. Mr. Henderson, we talked a little about the nonprofit security grant program earlier, and I'd like you and Mr. Yang as well to talk a little about that. This is an effort to provide community safety, community security. When we have gathered people in Ohio, it's the Christian community, it's the Sikh community, it's the Muslim community, the Jewish community, of course. But as someone who represents a broad coalition of these communities, how would you assess this program, and how can we get more people to apply, more people to understand it and to be able to take advantage of it?
Well, Mr. Portman, thank you for your question. It is an important issue, and certainly the Leadership Conference does represent nonprofit organizations that are committed to protecting civil and human rights. The engagement of these communities in addressing the problems that we have with domestic terrorism are critically important. But as I mentioned in my testimony, we have over 50 statutes on our federal books that can be used to prosecute individuals who are engaged in these activities. I alluded to the fact that those who are charged today with some of the violence directly related to the January 6th insurrection are being prosecuted based on these provisions. I think certainly educating nonprofit groups about the circumstances involved with domestic violence, encouraging the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security to help educate these communities as well on how to apply for these grants, how to use them appropriately, would be a very constructive contribution that would help these communities better understand how they can be a part of the solution to the problem. But I think the biggest issue that we have before us is how do we encourage the federal government and the appropriate agencies to use the tools at their disposal to prosecute domestic terrorism in an appropriate way. That does include, of course, educating individuals on the use, or rather communities, on the use of these nonprofit grant programs. I commend you for your support of them, and I hope they will be a part of a constructive, comprehensive effort to address this problem going forward.
Well said, Mr. Henderson. We've got to go to our next questioner, but let me say that the Pray Safe Act also provides this information of best practices, which I think is really critical, and Senator Hassan is actually a co-author of that legislation. I know she's going to question next, but I think that's another place for information that is easily accessible online, and I hope that this hearing, among other things, will give more people an understanding of the importance of that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Portman. I want to thank you and Chairman Peters for holding this hearing. I certainly want to thank all of our witnesses, not only for being here today, but for the work that you do. And Mr. Goldenberg and Mr. Jones, I want to start off with following up on some of the discussion you've had with both Senator Peters and Portman on the issue of online radicalization. Mr. Goldenberg, in your testimony, you compared some of the online radicalization techniques of groups like ISIS to similar efforts used by domestic terrorists online today. So, again, just adding to what you were talking about just now, in your view, are there lessons learned from combating ISIS's online radicalization efforts that can be applied to combating domestic terrorism threats?
Yeah, I think the primary lessons learned is it's almost, and I'm sorry, I'm going to use this as a comparison because I am a former police officer. It's when they interview the neighbor next door, and the neighbor next door, after a horrific crime is committed by the other neighbor, says, "I knew nothing. I knew nothing about this." Right. And I think it's incumbent upon us to really focus on training, spending time with families and educators and even the law enforcement community to better understand how social media, how this space, as wonderful it is, I call it the tale of two cities, has become a place where we have groomers and others that are seeking to radicalize your children, if not your teens, if not other adults. The tactics used by ISIS and Al-Qaeda and these and other groups that we'll call traditional foreign terrorist groups, these same tactics are being used right here in the United States by those that are asking for some to commit themselves to white supremacist ideology. It's the same tactics. It's the same tactics being used, the same marketing.
So what you're really saying too is educating the general public and families about the tactics that their loved ones could be subjected to online. Is that fair?
Absolutely. You know, the old cliche, if you see something, say something.
Right.
When I first heard it years ago, I come from the New York, New Jersey area.
Right.
Through 9/11, I rolled my eyes, Senator. And now I don't roll my eyes at that.
Right.
People, if they see something, if something's not right with a neighbor, with a friend, with a child, I'm not talking about people spying on each other. I'm talking about if there are signs and symptoms that say that someone that's close to you or someone that you love is now being potentially radicalized and these are the signs and the symbols, you need to step up and say something,
Okay.
and maybe save the next life,
Thank you.
including their own.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, you also mentioned the role of the internet and social media in contributing to the domestic terrorism threat. So in your view, what more can the U.S. government do to counter extremism and misinformation on digital platforms?
So thanks, Senator, for bringing up this issue. Two comments along these lines. One is, I should point out at the beginning, just to state the obvious, that a range of individuals and organizations involved in domestic terrorism are on multiple types of digital platforms, not just the big ones.
Right.
However, some of the large platforms like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube they're capable of reaching larger numbers of individuals. And I think one of the successful efforts, because I've worked with a range of these companies, they surged during the height of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda activity to identify on their platforms individuals that were radicalizing, both humans working for these companies as well as algorithms. Right. They've been slower in the areas we're talking about. They've been slower on white supremacists, anti-government militias, some of the anti-fascists and anarchists. They've been slower to devote the resources, the individual expertise. I think they've started to move a little bit faster, but I would say more pressure on these companies. And again, I'm not talking about free speech here. I'm talking about violence.
Right.
Taking down Facebook pages that are inciting people to violence.
Right.
And I think, in that sense, a number of European governments are ahead of the U.S. in along these lines. So I think that's one issue. And it is also worth highlighting that a range of these domestic organizations are learning. So they now know what they can get away with and what they can't. So this is a constant process of rejiggering algorithms and educating those that are analyzing digital platforms. What are the word choices they're using to instigate? But I think continual pressure on these companies is critical, and that includes holding hearings so that with senior officials from those companies, so that they're held accountable.
Thank you. I want to follow up with you on another issue now. I previously co-sponsored legislation to establish a commission that would review the information sharing process for both international and domestic terrorism. I was pleased to see that the first pillar of the Biden administration's new national strategy for countering domestic terrorism includes a goal to improve information sharing. Mr. Jones, in your view, what specific steps can the federal government take to improve sharing terrorism threat information with state and local partners, including information regarding domestic terrorism?
Well, look, I think there is an important role. The National Counterterrorism Center has increasingly, and I think this is important to recognize that we talk about domestic terrorism, including here, but there is a lot of overlap between domestic and international terrorism. So I think the National Counterterrorism needs to continue at the federal level to also focus on this interplay between domestic and international terrorism. I also think then that there's an important relationship between the National Counterterrorism Center and the JTTFs, the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and the fusion centers that they can share information. So the FBI legats oversees the legal attaches, and those that are embedded in JTTFs as well as the National Counterterrorism Center. I think there is an important need to continue to push information from the federal level down to the state and local level and ease a little bit these walls between international and domestic. I think NCTC has been far too conservative in defining terms.
Thank you very much. I am running out of time, so I'm going to submit my last two questions for the record, but I just wanted to thank Senator Portman for his partnership on the Pray Safe Act. And Mr. Fingerhut, I will be submitting two questions for the record to you about the importance of having a clearinghouse for faith-based organizations and houses of worship about best practices, as well as just trying to get your comments on ways we can continue to work with the nonprofit and faith-based community on the nonprofit security grant program so that they are better able to access these grants, and perhaps we can streamline the application process for them. So thank you all so much for your expertise and for sharing it with us this morning. And I see that the chair is back, so I'm going to hand the gavel back to him.
Thank you, Senator. The chair now recognizes Senator Rosen for your questions.
Thank you. That was a swift move between Senator Hassan, and thank you, Chair Peters, for recognizing me. And really, I want to thank you and Ranking Member Portman for holding this important hearing. As co-chair of the first ever Senate Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, I am pleased to have this hearing, and I want to welcome my friend Eric Fingerhut from the Jewish Federations of North America and thank him for being with us today. And as others have touched upon, I want to talk a little bit about the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, because over the past few years, particularly since this spring, we've seen a dangerous increase in anti-Semitism, including the deadliest attacks on the Jewish community in modern American history. Just 3 years ago, of course, we had the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and in May 2021 alone, the ADL recorded 251 anti-Semitic incidences, a 115% jump from the same period last year. And those are just what's reported. We know many things go unreported. So to protect synagogues, Jewish community centers, and other nonprofits against terrorist attacks and targeted violence, the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, or NSGP, it makes FEMA grants available to eligible nonprofit organizations so they can for target hardening and other security enhancements. And so despite the alarming rise in anti-Semitism, NGSP fulfilled less than half of the applications that it received for grants this year, far outstripping the $180 million appropriated by Congress in fiscal year 2021. And so, Mr. Fingerhut, I just really want to thank you for speaking to the importance of doubling the NSGP funding from $180 million to $360 million in your opening statement. It's critical to meeting the growing needs of the program to keep all of our communities secure. And so now I just want to follow up on many of the discussions that we've had so far. Rural communities, suburban communities, they've often historically experienced resource gaps. They face challenges in accessing nonprofit security grants to protect themselves against anti-Semitic, domestic terrorist attacks and targeted violence. And so, Mr. Fingerhut, how do you think Congress can ensure that these communities receive the sufficient federal support, including our outreach efforts and technical assistance to better access this important program? Oops, we can't hear you.
My apologies. Thank you, Senator Rosen, and thank you particularly for citing the statistics regarding the percentage of the applications for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program that were able to be filled by the existing funding sources. It's under 50%. And I think we just have to be honest and say that it's not that institutions are not aware of the need to take extraordinary measures now to secure their facilities. Regretfully, I think all faith-based institutions and nonprofit institutions in our country are becoming aware of the threats that they face, and particularly, regrettably, I must say it's true of the Jewish community, which for 23 straight years has experienced the largest percentage of hate crimes, according to FBI statistics, of any religious based group. But it's now the knowledge and the skill and the ability to fulfill the technical requirements of the applications. And so I'll just again mention a couple of quick things that I've previously mentioned, and I'd be more than happy to follow up with the committee and with your office for details. First of all, it is time that as part of the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, that we not only have a sufficient level of funding consistent over time, but that we also allocate sufficient resources to FEMA and to the state-based institutional partners who administer these grants to assist them in developing the expertise to working with the nonprofit communities. They haven't received the resources for them to be able to be in that position of expertise.
Thank you.
And as I've also mentioned, and I really can't emphasize enough, I do believe that it's time, we do believe that it's time for the Congress to designate the nonprofit and the faith-based sectors as critical infrastructure to this country with respect to domestic violence, which would trigger the development of comprehensive strategic plans by Department of Homeland Security, by federal law enforcement, FBI, and others. Senator, you know better than anyone, as a former synagogue president yourself, how critical our faith-based institutions are to the delivery of communal services in our great country. This is the freest, safest country in the history of the Jewish people, but regrettably, as you said, in the last 20 years, we've experienced dramatic rises in violent extremism and actual attacks, and we need to fill in the gaps.
Thank you. I'd like, in the short time I have left, I'd like to talk about the links between domestic terrorism, anti-Semitism, and anti-AAPI hate. The recent rise in anti-Semitism, of course, closely correlated with the spread of domestic extremist ideologies, neo-Nazis, the organization of this base. It's driven by ideological trafficking and conspiracies against Jewish control of society. The QAnon movement is out there. And I welcome the administration's recent Joint Comprehensive Threat Assessment on domestic violent extremism, but I'm disappointed that the report did not account for the nexus between anti-Semitism and violent extremism. So this question to Mr. Goldenberg and Mr. Yang, can you describe the connection between domestic violent extremist ideologies and anti-Semitism, motivation, tax system recruitment? And Mr. Yang, of course, we have those same issues happening right now with anti-AAPI conspiracy theories and domestic extremism. So I know maybe I'll have to take them off the record because I see my time is expiring, but I will submit them to both of you. I really want to hear what you have to say. We need to be a no place for hate society, and we have to stand together in this fight. So I don't know who's after me, Mr. Chair, but I guess I'll take my answers off the record.
Senator Rosa, if you'd like more time, you can take more time. We're waiting for another member to appear.
Well, that's
so please,
great. Well, I guess you can answer because we're waiting for another senator to come either online or in the room. So I guess Mr. Goldenberg and then Mr. Yang, please.
Okay. Yeah, there is an absolute common denominator between the extremist, the violent extremists on the right and the violent extremists on the left. And that common denominator, unfortunately, for some of these groups is their apparent hatred of the Jewish people. It is, we have seen online, we have studied some of the rhetoric and the chatter, and in many cases they may not agree with each other theoretically, politically, or any other which way, but when it comes to their hatred of the Jewish people, they use the same anti-Semitic rhetoric, the books, the elders. I can mention a half a dozen different the protocols of Zion. They actually share this information with each other. So if they completely disagree, sometimes even violently with each other on many other issues, at the core, it's anti-Semitism that unfortunately does bring them together.
Thank you for that disturbing answer. And Mr. Yang, can you talk a little bit about the connection of these anti-AAPI conspiracy theories and domestic violence that we've seen, particularly on the rise during COVID?
Absolutely, and thank you for that. I think one common denominator that we haven't talked about, both with respect to anti-Semitism and anti-Asian American hate, is this climate of fear. This notion that, we are living in fear, we have to blame someone for the fear. Here, it's with respect to COVID-19 as it applies to the Asian American community. And what we are seeing is misinformation about the origins of COVID-19, if you will, the fact that Asian Americans eat bats or that Asian Americans are unsanitary. And that is why COVID-19 is here in the United States. One of the first physical attacks against an Asian American down in Texas was by a person against a father with two very little kids. And at the same time, he is saying, you guys are the reason that COVID-19 is here. So what we need to do is make sure we don't sow those seeds of fear. And that's incumbent on all of us as leaders to use the right words. That's not going to do the trick alone, but to make sure that we are not part of the problem in creating that climate of fear, that somehow we have to fear Chinese people or fear the Asian countries. That's what we've seen also in the Jewish American community, as you know, is that fear is what drives some of the extremism that we've seen. So those are a distinct element that I would want to name right now.
Thank you. And Dr. Jones, I'm going to follow up for the record because I'm way over my time, but I really want to talk about the specific steps the administration that we can take to address this linkage between bigotry, anti-Semitism, anti-AAPI hate, other forms of systemic racism, and with violent extremism and especially white supremacy. So thank you for indulging me, Senator Peters. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Senator Rosen, as always, for great questions. We appreciate those and appreciate the answers. Mr. Yang, you've talked quite a bit today about the increased violence against Asian Americans, and we've had discussions related to social media and how that is really just say furthering some of these attacks in communities across the country. I would like you to talk a little bit specifically with the Asian Americans as to how social media and misinformation related to COVID-19 has particularly had a significant impact on your community and what we should be doing about it.
Thank you very much for that question. There's a couple of things. Number one is, with respect to that misinformation, that actually caused an effect on the Asian American community with respect to COVID-19 before any other community, before anything else. Even before we had the first case of COVID-19 here in the United States, Asian Americans were being discriminated against, especially in their businesses, because about this misinformation about the hygiene of Asian American businesses, about the cause of COVID-19 and how Asian Americans might be special carriers of that. Then that translated into actual cases of violence against our community because of what we saw on social media. The number of times that we saw that picture of a fake picture of an Asian American eating a bat that caused so many attacks against our community. Before this hearing, I took a quick look at the statistics with respect to anti-Asian attacks against our community from our own website. I've recorded very quickly over a dozen cases in which, while that person was attacking an Asian American, they were talking about Asian Americans eating bats. And so that disinformation is part of the issue that we need to address, right? And I do agree that it is both digital literacy, as I would call it, with respect to people that are consuming that information, as well as content moderation with respect to the platforms that are allowing those pieces to proliferate. But again, I would also go to the source, which is, who is it that is causing that or seeding that racism, seeding that extremism? Because those are also the groups, the individuals that we need to address head on.
Thank you, Mr. Goldenberg. As a former vice chair of DHS's Faith-Based Advisory Security Council, you made a number of recommendations regarding how the department should address the rise of violence in faith-based communities. My question for you today, though, is given where we are today, what do you think is the most important action that the Department of Homeland Security must take?
I think it's ownership. The department is vast. We all know several 100,000 good individuals are over there. And the initiative really needs to have ownership, someone at a very senior level that could transverse across all the various divisions and departments and offices that really focuses on this issue. And I have to agree wholeheartedly with Eric Fingerhut, whom I know for several years, that This should be considered a part of critical infrastructure. If our houses of worship are not critical infrastructure, I'm not sure what is. And as I said before, it has definitely become an Achilles heel. We also, in one more thing we do need to be thinking about, and I'd like to put on the record, is the fact, with First Amendment, with threats that are coming through social media, the fact that we have people in vulnerable communities that are deeply concerned about their safety and security and feel terrorized by threats vis-a-vis social media, where is the law broken? When can an investigation be opened up? Where does DOJ or a state's attorney's office, where can they now open up an investigation predicated upon a person's concern that their safety is at stake? And that's a great concern right now. Take a look at how many cases have been opened up where someone is threatened over the internet and there's absolutely nowhere to go with it. You don't even know what agency to report it to. So these are the things that I think that we need to be very focused on.
Well, thank you for that. Senator Ossoff, you are now recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for your invaluable contributions today. Mr. Henderson, I'd like to begin with a question directed to you. You noted in your testimony that in 2017, the Department of Justice found that while just over 7,000 hate crimes had been reported, they assessed that the real number was likely in the range of 250,000. What legislative action is needed to ensure we have a clear national accounting of hate crimes that's accurate and consistent over time so that we can track these trends with more accuracy?
Senator Ossoff, thank you for that question. As you know, there is the Hate Crimes Statistics Act, which I believe was first enacted in 1991. It requires police departments around the country, law enforcement institutions, to report hate crimes that have been brought to their attention. But the information provided to the federal government is voluntary. The number of police departments that participate in this effort has always been relatively small in comparison to the number of entities existing in the country. And most of the information provided is incredibly incomplete. But there is no sense of urgency, no sense of obligation on the part of these departments to provide that information. Certainly, Congress could make reporting mandatory, and that would help. And certainly providing departments with the technical skill to document and record hate crime violence reported to those institutions would be a huge help. And lastly, public education, trying to educate communities about the existence of this violence, what constitutes a hate crime, and how to go about documenting it would be an additional help. So I would argue that strengthening the Hate Crime Statistics Act is the first and most compelling step to be taken, but I think there are other collateral efforts, as we have just discussed, that could be supportive of that effort as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Would you kindly be willing to work with my office to determine how such legislative remedy might be most constructively drafted?
Senator Ossoff, we would welcome that opportunity and appreciate very much the invitation to do so.
Thank you very much. Mr. Yang, I'd like to check in with you on a matter of particular concern across the country and to many of my Asian American constituents in Georgia, and that is these appalling attacks in particular on Asian elders across the country, which you note in your testimony. Would you please provide the committee with an update on the trend, the incidence of these attacks, what you're currently seeing and analyzing?
Sure. Thank you very much for that question, Senator Ossoff. And unfortunately, the trend has still been relatively high with respect to attacks against Asian Americans. And again, we've talked about this. One thing I should note is that the attacks against Asian American women in particular is appalling. Women are being attacked at almost 2 times the rate of men. And this is not an issue just for the Asian American community, but if we are talking about domestic terrorism, if we're talking about extremism, another issue that we need to make sure that we address is violence against women. And unfortunately, with respect to this hearing, we don't have a female speaker to talk about these issues. But if we dig deeper, that's another issue that we should address. The last thing that I would want to note is that we should also continue to think about what it means to prevent these types of issues, these types of acts from happening. And we've talked a lot about response, how we need to harden some of our nonprofits, harden some of our churches. And I certainly agree with that as a response. But we also need to think about how we connect with our communities, invest in our communities so they feel safer. They feel safer without the need to over-criminalize or use law enforcement as the solution to all of these problems.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. Mr. Fingerhut, I'd like to talk a bit about federal policy that helps to secure places of worship as well as nonprofits. I would just note it's on the one hand, a signal of progress. I think that Georgia elected for the first time a black man and a Jewish man to represent our state in the U.S. Senate. I was sworn in on the Chumash that belonged to Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, who'd been the chief rabbi at my childhood synagogue, the Temple, which was bombed by white supremacists in 1958 in retaliation for Rabbi Rothschild's alliance with Dr. King in support of the civil rights movement. And it is certainly my ambition that we strengthen and sustain the vital and historic alliance between blacks and Jews in America, which was forged with such intensity during the civil rights movement. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Fingerhut, about your assessment of the efficacy of the nonprofit security grant program, how it can be improved, as well as the efficacy of the DHS protective security advisors and cybersecurity advisors, which are assisting nonprofits and faith-based groups to protect themselves from both physical and cyber threats.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff, for the question and the historic significance of your election and that of Senator Warnock was certainly well noted within the community, as was the dramatic personal statement you made with regard to your choice of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, for your swearing in. And we commit to you, together, of course, with the Jewish Federations located in your home state of Georgia, particularly, of course, our great Atlanta Jewish Federation, to work as closely with you and Senator Warnock as we possibly can, as well as on a national basis to fulfill the vision that you've so beautifully laid out for us here. As I have addressed in this hearing, it is unfortunately the case that we now have a wide recognition, Senator, of the need to have a layer of physical security in all of our faith-based institutions and our nonprofit institutions that we never thought we would have to have. As you travel the world, it is routine that there are security guards and physical security of all kinds outside of faith-based institutions, and we regret that now that reality has now come to our great country. We are in catch-up mode, frankly, sir, because there is not only the growing need, which the federal government is not yet adequately funding. The funding levels that are currently available, as has already been noted, covered roughly 50% of the applications this year, but even that is only a reflection of the knowledge and the growing capacity of institutions to apply. It's nowhere near where we believe all of the faith-based institutions and communities need to be. So we need long-term consistent funding. We need the expertise of FEMA and of our state emergency institutions that partner with FEMA to get this done. And as you suggested, our cyber advisors, we need to have a much closer working relationship between the protective security advisors and the cybersecurity advisors in the Department of Homeland Security, Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the nonprofit community. We believe all of that can come from the designation of the faith-based institutions and nonprofits as critical infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Fingerhut. With the chairman's indulgence, just one more question for Mr. Goldenberg. You noted in your testimony some of the parallels with Europe, this increase in sectarianism, tribalism that we're seeing in European and North American societies right now. As we all strive to build a society and a world where the dignity and the human rights and the human value of each individual is sacred and protected regardless of our race, our creed, our ethnicity, our faith. It's deeply troubling that we're seeing this increase in these levels of sectarianism and hatred. And I'd like, in closing, Mr. Goldenberg, if you might comment on why do you believe we're seeing these trends in societies on both sides of the Atlantic? What are the parallels?
I think the parallels, well, look, I first started to travel abroad almost nearly 20 years ago at the request of the OSCE, the Office for Security and Cooperation for Europe. And we started to raise the flags back then when we started to see these groups that were considered once marginalized becoming mainstream. There's a total disconnect, although it's gotten much better in Europe with with vulnerable communities and the police that are sworn to protect them as well. But again, for the record, that has improved greatly. You know, social media has no borders. These ideologies seem to have no borders, and people are sharing this information across the globe with a click of a finger, where years ago these things took much longer. You heard Senator Portman mention flash to bang, and what that really means, flash to bang, is that people are being radicalized. They are sitting in front of computers. They're frustrated potentially with their own governments for whatever reason, and they're moving from flash to operationalizing these targeted acts of violence. I think that social media, the internet, has become a place where these ideologies and these and the methodologies for attack are being shared almost on a daily basis. Wherever you have, as we all know, a downturn in the economy, people will look to scapegoat. In this case, I think COVID has accelerated much of that. For the first time in history, billions of people were home sitting in front of their computers and depending on information that they weren't sure is factual or not factual. So we're in a very fragile place right now. And what we've seen 10, 15 years ago, as I stated, 20 years ago in Europe, has come to fruition here in the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Goldenberg. Thank you to our panel. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thanks for the extra time.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Hawley, you are recognized for your question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being patient and for the witnesses. Multiple, as is often the case, as I'm sure you've figured out, there are multiple hearings going on at one time, so I've been running back and forth, and I appreciate the chairman accommodating me here so that I could come and ask questions. Thank you for the witnesses who are here remotely as well. I want to start with some questions about the anti-Semitic violence that we have seen, unfortunately, in this country, and seen a significant uptick of it over a period of years, but particularly in the last few months. This May, during the latest conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, we saw violence abroad that spilled over here domestically. Jews across the United States were reportedly threatened or physically attacked in at least 193 different instances of anti-Semitic violence or threats during the first week of that conflict, which is remarkable. For example, pro-Palestinian protesters threatened, shoved, punched, threw fireworks in the Diamond District of Midtown Manhattan, which is an area with many Jewish-owned businesses. That led to 27 arrests and the hospitalization of multiple people. In Los Angeles, pro-Palestinian protesters attacked a group of Jewish men who were eating at a restaurant. While they attacked them, they waved Palestinian flags and hurled anti-Semitic slurs. We've even seen members of Congress, sadly, use anti-Semitic rhetoric. One member of Congress called Israel an apartheid state, said it was committing war crimes. Another said after the ceasefire that Israel's ethnic cleansing continues. Another congresswoman called then Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu an ethno-nationalist, fascist basically, during a speech on the House floor. This is very, very concerning. The violence is very concerning. The rhetoric from anti-Semitic groups is very concerning. The anti-Semitic rhetoric from members of Congress is very concerning and frankly inexcusable. So, Mr. Fingerhead, if I could just come to you. You've discussed, I know today, and in your testimony, some of the despicable attacks that have occurred against the Jewish community over the past few years. Can I just ask you what role you think the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas has played or might play in exacerbating these violent attacks and this violent rhetoric that we're seeing in, unfortunately, too many places?
Thank you, Senator Hawley. I'm not sure I want to use the word thank you, but I appreciate the fact that you did recite some of the additional violent incidents we've seen in this country in recent months that I did not mention in my initial testimony. I think, sir, there is no question but that we have indeed witnessed a rise in violent extremism against the Jewish community in the last couple months. That coincided with the recent, what was called Operation Guardians of the Walls war in Israel. And I have no doubt that is also being reflected not only in the actual physical attacks, but in the threats that are being recorded by law enforcement and the threats that are being tracked by organizations like ADL and others. I know Mr. Goldenberg spoke earlier, my friend and colleague, of the online threats against anti-Semitism, which seem to unite radical extremists left and right. I seem to be unified in their hatred of Jews and of the embrace of classical anti-Semitic tropes. And there's no doubt that we've seen that grow and a increasing attack on all and every Jewish community as a result of what has occurred the last couple of months. I do want to emphasize, however, Senator, that while I do think there's no question that there has been a dramatic increase in these last couple of months, that unfortunately it reflects a continuation of an increase that we have seen continuously over a number of years. That, as I indicated earlier, I believe since the passage of the Hate Crime Statistics Act, which Mr. Henderson spoke so knowledgeably of earlier in his responses to the panel's questions, that for 23 straight years of the gathering of the statistics under the Hate Crime Statistics Act by the FBI, the Jewish community was the religious organization singled out for the largest number of those recorded statistical threats and attacks. So this is indeed something that has been a rising threat. As I indicated also in my prepared remarks, we now have over 45 Jewish community federations that have felt the need to build professionalized community security initiatives to work with and mobilize each and every one of our synagogues and Jewish community centers and human services agencies. And we are in the midst of a national campaign to extend that umbrella everywhere. We are continuing to build the resources of our secure community network to work with DHS and FBI. So the increase we've seen recently builds on top of, unfortunately, a very significant rise over recent years.
Yeah, thank you for that. And what you're saying, in other words, is that sadly, this is a trend. It is a trend of many years in the making, and recent events have accelerated it. And it's unbelievably sad that the security measures that you just described, that so many synagogues and other Jewish communities, neighborhood communities are taking, it's unbelievably sad that these measures are necessary, and it's unbelievably wrong that they are necessary in this country. I want to ask you, just to come back to the events of this last May, this last spring, do you think that the current administration offered enough support for the Jewish community during the recent conflict? And I mean American Jews, the Jewish community in the United States. And is there anything else that, in a proactive sense, you would like to see the administration or Congress do? And here's where I'm going with this, Mr. Fingerhut. It just simply can't be that every time there is a conflict involving the state of Israel, that it therefore becomes okay to attack American Jews. It becomes okay to engage in anti-Semitic conduct publicly. I mean, that just simply can't be the case, because, as you say, we're dealing here with a long-term rise in anti-Semitic conduct And the idea that, oh, well, we'll just say that it's anti-Israel and therefore it's okay. I mean, that we cannot possibly condone that as a way to see further, to excuse further violence, further rhetoric. So what more can Congress and the administration do?
Yes, Senator Hawley, first of all, I could not agree with you more that it cannot possibly be okay, and it is not okay that every time there is conflict in the between Israel and its neighbors, that it results in a rise in anti-Semitic attacks in this country. It is unacceptable, and I agree with you completely. You asked two different questions. The first was you asked about the response of the President Biden and Biden administration. I will say that they did speak out forcefully with regard to the increase in anti-Semitism that came about during this most recent conflict. I want to thank Mr. Henderson, Mr. Yang, and all the other civil rights organizations that joined in a forceful statement letter to President Biden. I believe over 180 organizations spoke out together at that time to the president, to the Biden administration, and the president personally responded within 24 hours to that letter. I also want to acknowledge the recent nomination of Professor Deborah Lipstadt as the special envoy for anti-Semitism, something that had been long sought by the Jewish community and that we hope the Senate will take up expeditiously. I want to acknowledge as well, also again with Mr. Yang, we were proud to support together with the Asian American Pacific Islander community and the Leadership Conference the No Hate Act, which recently passed, which will enhance the crime and statistics. So as to your second question, Senator Hawley, with what regard to what more Congress can do, I believe we've covered it to some extent, but I know that it's important to repeat because of the nature of this hearing that we are nowhere near the funding levels necessary for the nonprofit security grant program. We need to enhance the ability of FEMA and the state agencies to work with faith-based institutions of all kinds to help them harden their facilities, and we need to provide the comprehensive designation necessary so that we attack this problem comprehensively. Senator Hawley, you know very well, and you've spoken beautifully about it on many occasions, the important critical role that the faith-based community and the nonprofit sector plays in American civil society. We are partners with government in every respect in delivering human services and caring for our community, in providing the emotional and educational well-being of our community. During the recent COVID pandemic, we partnered effectively with this Congress repeatedly on various funding and other strategic measures to make sure that resources got to the nonprofit and faith-based communities to secure their ability to continue to serve their communities during this terrible time. And now we need to do the same thing in a much more comprehensive way on the issue of domestic terrorism.
Thank you very much for that testimony. And Mr. Chairman, I'll say in conclusion, again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your generosity here. But I just wanted to say in conclusion that I think it's vital that we are clear that anti-Semitism in any guise, whether it's from the right or whether it's from the left, whatever its excuse is wrong. And as a person of faith, I just want to say, taking a stand on my faith, that it is wrong. It is morally wrong, and there should be and can be no excuse for it, whether it's wrapped up in a policy excuse or something else. But we've got to be absolutely crystal clear about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. And I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's hearing, and I'd certainly like to say a special thanks to our witnesses for joining us today and providing their unique perspective and expertise on what is clearly a very complex issue. Our witnesses today have provided us with insight into the current domestic terrorism threat that we face. We have heard compelling details about the real-world impact that domestic terrorism and violent extremism have on our communities, and how related hateful rhetoric and misinformation are readily amplified by social media platforms. Importantly, we have also been reminded that although these threats are clearly not new, for many communities of color and religious groups, they are growing and an agonizing presence in their daily lives, and that is simply unacceptable. We cannot ignore this growing threat and climate of intimidation and the many horrific acts of violence we have seen in recent years. Too many families and communities have been shattered by extremist attacks, and the federal government must urgently focus its efforts to combat the domestic terrorism threat and prevent future tragedies. On Thursday, I will convene a second hearing with additional experts, including former administration officials, to examine what reforms are needed to ensure the government's resources and personnel are adequately aligned to address this deadly threat. In testimony before Congress, several of our national security officials have called domestic terrorism, and in particular white supremacist violence, the greatest threat to our homeland security. As chairman of this committee, I'll work along with my colleagues to ensure that these words are followed by concrete actions to actually tackle this threat with the seriousness that it warrants. As part of that effort, we will hold additional hearings in the fall as well, which will include current government officials to discuss their work to address domestic terrorism. I will note that the record for this hearing will remain open until 5 p.m. on August 18th, 2021 for the submission of statements and questions for the record. With that, this committee hearing is now adjourned.